Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got an episode I've wanted to get off my chest for a while, all about sport specificity. And we wanted to do this topic because in the ever polarized world of social media, it's something that's got a lot of attention recently, where we have two camps, the Uber sport specific camp and the general physical preparedness camp, where we do general S&C, and that should cover all bases. So in this episode, we're going to dig into the nuance in this long form style and give you our thoughts on where our opinion lies in that balance and hopefully challenge your thought process slightly. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website to download your free guide to movement mechanics. If you're a PT, coach, or manual therapist, there should be some useful info in there for you. Thank you also to wit-fitness.com. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro for all your blood flow restriction apparel. Use our discount code LL20 to get 20% off.
Right. Yeah, Ash.
Rob.
So this episode, it's a very interesting one. And the reason for me I love this is because when you look at social media and the polarizing nature of it, like if you're in the middle, if you're in the gray area, you just don't get noticed. So if you're saying stuff that's a bit, bland, okay, you should maybe have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, it just doesn't get heard.
Yeah.
So what Instagram obviously wants, or any social media platform, is those polarizing views, because they're the views that make people say, no, it's either the opposite, or no, it's the middle.
Yeah.
And I feel as we're getting exposed to more and more of that, people are actually forgetting the nuance of a lot of these topics. And even the people saying the polarizing messaging believe a lot of the time about the nuance, about the middle. They do, like, deep down, if you talk to them, they do believe it does lie in the middle, but they're using the platform to kind of polarize the audience. And it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
It's a really slippery slope, because people are getting confused, and especially people that aren't necessarily as versed up in the topics. They might be thinking, "Oh, okay, this is it. This is the only way to do things." So, what kind of really got you going here? What was there, any particular posts or anything like that kind of got you? You don't need to say the individual.
I think it's built up over time. I've seen a few things pop up, and you're spot on in terms of why they pop up is because the algorithms optimize for engagement. So engagement is measured in a lot of different ways, but essentially time on device is the major metric that the social media platforms are optimizing for. So if you see a post that challenges your thought process because it's the opposite of what you think, you're probably going to read it a little bit more carefully because, oh shit, that's not what I thought. And especially if you disagree with it, you're probably going to read the caption, you're probably going to read the comments, you might comment to argue. And for the social media companies, that's what they want. They want you spending as much time on the device as possible. So what you see on social media, the people who play the game really well, is they'll put up a lot of this type of content to polarize people, to drive debate, to get people really pissed off. I think if you're pissed off, you're much more likely to read a post than one that you totally agree with. So on this theme of sport specificity, I think people who are playing that game deliberately create content which is very absolute. So that's the other thing about what you're saying there, where social media is devoid of nuance, is that people like one simple statement, which is the whole truth, the whole story, and there's no caveats. And as you said, the truth often has nuance, has caveats, but you can't put that in a tweet. You can't put that in a short Instagram post. So for me, the thing I take issue with about this topic is the notion that strength and conditioning has standard movements and that everyone should do the standard movements, become generally fit and strong, and that's what you should be doing in the gym, in the weight room, to prepare yourself for sport. And that's such an oversimplification, so reductive, and also untrue in many cases,
Yeah.
that I thought it'd be worth doing a nice long episode to dig into this nuance and explain my thinking.
Yeah, because I do feel that even beyond the world of social media, so when you start to go back even to like with the fitness sphere, and you then look at say CrossFit when that first come out, and even probably still to this day, the methodology is you do CrossFit, you're ready for life. And like it means you're ready to do anything, and to some respect that's true, because you've now got a better tolerance to stress, whether that's strength, whether that's through aerobic and anaerobic type movements. But where I think the issue then comes is, okay, if you do CrossFit, you're going to be better at football, or you do CrossFit, or even better, as you've pointed out to me before, you want to get better at golf, do golf WOD. It's like it's like add the word WOD after a sport, and there you go. It makes it specific to your sport,
Yeah.
and I think it'd be worth then setting the scene to kind of get people to understand, because obviously we've kind of highlighted there the bit of stress that's kind of coming from the social media posts that are out there.
Yeah.
What is your thoughts about setting the scene here?
Yeah. So I think the fundamental question underlying this is, how closely does your training need to match your sport? So if you do a general physical preparedness program, how similar do the movements need to be to the movements of your sport? Or like you say, can you do a GPP program and that will adequately prepare you for all sports? And I'm going to present the case for no. Like any one single GPP program is going to have strengths and weaknesses. It's going to
Yeah,
cover some types of sport really well, and it's going to leave some sports in the dark, because the underlying assumption is that all sports have a similar demand on the body, which is just absolutely not true. So um, the whole premise of weight room stuff being, we go to the gym to prepare ourselves to be better at our sport, is actually relatively recent. And
mm,
there's a lot of sportsmen, a lot of athletes that have become phenomenally good at their sports without doing any dedicated strength and conditioning. Because the truth is, sports practice will develop your strength and will make you conditioned for your sport. And my favorite example of this is Michael Phelps in is actually his second Olympics, because he went to one as a young teenager. But the second Olympics he went to, he won 6 gold medals, and he had never stepped foot into the weight room. So
yeah,
he had become probably the best swimmer ever, having never lifted a weight. For his third Olympics, he did then start doing some training in the gym and continued to be great. But the point is, we're only supposed to be doing strength and conditioning for sport insofar as it improves your sporting performance. And I think there's a misleading notion in the fitness industry that the strength and conditioning becomes the goal.
yeah,
And these general movement foundations are what we should be optimizing for, when actually what we should be optimizing for is on pitch performance or output in your sport.
yeah,
For example, if you're a footballer, you're doing strength and conditioning, you want to win more football matches. You don't want to PB your back squat, but you might go to the gym. Your S&C coach might be looking at numbers and being like, "Oh, you haven't PB'd your back squat for a long time. We need to do a squat cycle." That's not necessarily true. Like, you might do that squat cycle at the expense of your football performance rather than
yeah.
um, and I think, yeah, if we carry that line of logic through, a lot more detail will come out.
Yeah, I feel with the industry as it used to be, it did seem that the reason people didn't train in the gym because they thought it slowed them down. You
Mhm.
can't be muscle bound, you can't be this, you can't be that. So you understand the camp of you just need to do the sport to be good at the sport. You understand, because using Michael Phelps as an example, he got good at his sport. He got very good at his
Yeah,
sport by just doing the sport. So then it's okay. They didn't realize the potentials of, okay, adding in some proper sport specific weight room activities to help enhance his longevity in the sport and improve his output. And
yeah,
that's like, as you said. So, but I think we also get very blurred in the lines here, where the GPP crowd need to remember who they're talking to. Are
Yeah.
you talking to people who just want to be physically prepared for life? Or are you talking to people that want to be good at a sport?
Yeah.
Because it's like, if you keep those two things away, I think that's where this doesn't actually have it doesn't even have an argument. It's just true. But then when you start to then blend them together and then start being a bit more definitive about things, as you're saying about you can just do, you can squat, hinge, push, pull, and you'll be sweet for all sports and everything. It's like there's a little bit more nuance. And obviously now let's dive into that a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
So let's maybe start to argue the point about S&C training for general movements and the qualities to lay the foundations for your sports training.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a nice way to frame it, in that we think the human body has fundamental movements which everyone should do in similar proportions, or which everyone should be competent in. I like your example there of one of the challenges to S&C from a lot of sports has been that they slow down the athletes.
Mm.
And it's true. Like, if you train incorrectly, in the wrong way, you are driving opposite adaptations for many sports. And the classic one here is fighters. So
Yeah.
a lot of boxers hated doing weights because it stiffened them up, made them less fluid, made their jabs slower, and they could feel it. Like, if
Mm.
you're a boxer and your hands are slower and you go sparring, you feel it. So they would know, and they
You
could
feel it
link.
in your face.
Exactly, yeah. So they can clearly link the input to the output to
Yeah.
say, this S&C actually isn't improving my boxing. I don't want to do it. And they're heavily invested in being as good at
Mm.
boxing as possible. So that then begs the question, why are you doing S&C? You're doing S&C to be a better boxer. So the way that you're doing S&C isn't actually supporting your boxing performance. So we need to be more considerate of the demands of the sport of boxing, because the classic S&C movements and style of training just aren't delivering. So one of the arguments that we should train general movement qualities rather than doing more sports specific ones is that athletes are already doing sports specific movements because they are doing the sport, and they shouldn't do any more because then they're just going to overload those movements.
Yeah.
And this is, in my mind, they're arguing against something that nobody's saying, and that people who work in sport understand progressive overload. They understand overtraining. So that principle is always, that's ever present, right? You can do too much of something and you can get hurt, but that
Mm.
doesn't mean you shouldn't do as much as possible without getting hurt. Like, if you
Yeah.
want to get good at running, you shouldn't be doing tons of weights and less running. You should be doing as much running as you can get away with without hurting yourself. And actually doing more of the similar patterns is the best way to condition yourself for that task. So if we take that running example a little bit further, if somebody is going to go and do an ultra marathon, say they're going to be on their feet for 8 hours, let's say, and which body do you think is going to hold up? Somebody who does, let's say, 30 hours of cardio on their feet per week, or somebody who does 30 hours of cardio on a bike per week?
Mm.
Intuitively, we all know that the tissue
Yeah.
tolerance in the runner is going to carry over to the ultra marathon. So what I'm not saying is that somebody should go from 0 hours to 30 hours over a short period of time. Progressive overload still applies. We still need to be sensible with how we build up that volume, but the volume being as close to the demands on the body of the athlete as possible should be what we're trying to work towards. We shouldn't be trying to make them good across the board. Then, unless they're a CrossFitter, they need to be good at a variety of different movements. But in most sports, we have a clear picture of what that body needs to be able to do. So we should be conditioning it closely for what we want it to be able to do. And that only comes from either doing the thing or doing something that's similar to the thing, which is why sports specific exercises were invented in the first place.
Yeah. I think the sport specific exercises is the key part of this conversation, because when we start to think about what sport specific exercises are, I think we can have a visualization of Bosu balls. We can have a visualization of maybe all these
Yeah.
obscure movements for obscurity's sake. Like,
Yes.
it's, and that's not necessarily what this is. And again, it's probably everything's going to keep relating back to social media, because it's what the narrative is being put out there, and it's us. These movements are being put out there because they're unique, they're different,
Yeah.
they're eye catching. So you're like, oh, okay, and they say, right, this is specific for this like sport. You're like, I can kind of see it, and it's just because it looks bigger, like looks more flamboyant than it actually needs to be. But
Yeah.
then when you actually go right back and you realize that, okay, they are technically right. Like what he's saying, like some of these movements are correct, but maybe you just don't need to take it to that level of obscurity and actually say the movement pattern of what you're doing is correct. You're
Yeah.
supposed to be moving in that plane, moving with that sort of rotation to open up yourself. So when we get into the on the pitch or wherever, your body's been exposed to that position and you strengthen that position. So you feel good getting into that position and getting out of it.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So, in that social media optimization points, the other side of the equation is trying to grab attention through novelty and doing crazy exercises. So we talked about, I'm going to name drop Joel Seedman, because he's known for this. He's known for doing crazy, ridiculous exercises, which no one's ever seen before, and they're insane. And he gets loads of stick because they're so ridiculous. And he's spoken about this on podcasts where he says, I deliberately optimize for attention, and I actually stick to the fundamentals most of the time with most of my athletes. But whenever I think of something crazy, I'll put it up because it tangentially achieves the training stimulus. But more importantly, it grabs eyeballs,
Yeah.
and that's why he does it. And I think that's what garners the hate, is that you have these other people who are saying sports specificity equals crazy exercise, and sports specific doesn't necessarily have to be crazy, and in fact, it shouldn't be. The way I teach this, you've probably heard me talk about lots of times. We have a concept called the spectrum of specificity, and the more it looks like the thing you want to do, the more specific it is, the more carryover it's going to have, and the more effective it will be as an exercise, provided the training stimulus is retained. So when it comes to strength and conditioning, I think of designing or picking an exercise from two angles. You can either choose a standard strength and conditioning exercise and make it a little bit more like the sport, or you can take the sporting movement and take a step towards
The gym.
training
Yeah.
exercise. And that just makes things so simple. Like if you are, let's take another sport, like if you're a baseball pitcher, you're trying to throw a fastball, you could train your shoulder with bench press, you could train your shoulder with delt raises, or you could just throw a heavier ball, you could
Yep.
throw a lighter ball. That's clearly more sport specific. You're like the heavier ball, you probably develop more strength in that pattern. You're training the whole body as a system. You're training the motor pattern, the sequencing. If you need to change your technique, you need to change your technique. But your intended outcome is a faster fastball. So practicing the fastball, getting those muscles stronger and teaching them to fire faster is what you're trying to do. And you see all these like weird and wonderful exercises targeting one shoulder rotator cuff muscle, or like one aspect of one muscle. Like the thing you're trying to make better is the overall movement pattern of throwing
Yeah.
a baseball. So if you just do that with some resistance, or you do that faster than you could throw a normal baseball, the training stimulus on the body is very closely going to carry over to your sport, rather than trying to chunk it up into really tiny segments of the movement. And I think when you think about it like that, it is just so obvious. You don't need to do a 7-banded single leg like rotation in the rig like Joel Seedman might. So yeah, I think for me that sport specific exercise means stuff that looks quite close to the sport. And the only reason we go further away from the sport is if we really need to maintain the training stimulus that we want, or to reduce injury risk.
Yeah. And it just got me thinking when you was mentioning about like crazy exercises and things like that. And when I think of what's crazy, it's going to be different to what you think is crazy. And all of us have a level of, oh, that looks obscure or that looks different. And the reason I'm thinking of things like this is because when I was dabbling into the old time strongman stuff, some of it looks a bit out there. That's because because the fact that it's old time lifting is because the way they used to do it. And obviously, it's then changed over the years for whatever reason, mainly due to bodybuilding and due to powerlifting federation regulations. But there used to be such a different way of doing things. And because we've now so wound up in this way of this is now the way to do things, the craziness idea is sometimes things aren't actually that crazy. I mean, going to 7 bands in the like that just is obscure. But it is funny because it just got me thinking of what is crazy and what would my level of crazy be to say your level of crazy and to say the listener's level of crazy. And when it comes to like the baseball analogy, and I'm thinking about that throwing the ball, I think people think that because of how simplistic it is, it can't be the answer.
Yeah.
And I think it's like you just literally
You
throw in
can't put an
a
ebook
heavier
on that.
ball, and it got me thinking like that part of the training would not be necessarily the training. The training would be throw in the baseball, right? And then say, right, we're going to go through a block or so whatever, or some sessions where we're going to start throwing a heavier or lighter ball. Like when you got a runner, and you know when they run with the parachute and they're having that resistance, same thing. They're not going to run with a parachute all the time. It's just it's a tool in the toolbox to give them a different way where it keeps them as specific as possible to the sport of running or the activity of running.
Yeah.
But then they've added a form of resistance, so the specificity is very high.
Yes, exactly. So this is very in line with the next point I wanted to make, and that's the notion that people say the only thing that's going to get you better at your sport is doing your sport. This is just utter nonsense. There's so much stuff that gets you better at your sport that
Yeah.
isn't the sport, and that is the whole premise of training. It's the whole premise of S&C. Like
A lot of people
S&C,
would be out of jobs.
yeah, S&C was literally invented to make you better at sport. So not doing the sport in its purest form is training. Like if you're a Premier League footballer, you don't just play Premier League matches relentlessly. You do football training, and every drill in football training is an abstraction of the sport so that you can work on part of the game. And this is where sport specific stuff like running with a parachute, you're taking running and adding resistance to it, so you can develop the strength side of running more than you could running without the parachute. And that's why all of these drills are developed, whether it's a skill drill trying to overload and develop accuracy. So you hear like golfers putting into smaller holes, so they're trying to get even more accurate than they need to be on a course. Or you have weighted vests is another example. People doing anything in a weighted vest, it's the same movement, just your body weight's a little bit heavier. So we're always trying to isolate out part of the demand on the body and work on it. And it's not just the physical. Like, this is another thing that I take issue with. Only doing the sport makes you better at the sport. Psychology work makes you better at sport.
Yeah.
Diet, nutrition makes you better at sport. Recovery practices make you better at sport. So there's so many things that are not doing the sport that make you better at the sport, that I literally laughed out loud when I was preparing this, because it's such a ridiculous notion. And all coaches know this as well. When you're writing a program for somebody, if you're programming for a basketball player, you're more likely to program vertical jumps than broad jumps, because if they want to dunk a basketball, they need to get high, they don't need to get far. If you're trying to improve how far they could shoot a basketball, you're more likely to program a push press than a delt raise. They're both technically shoulder exercises, but one has more carryover to the motion of shooting a basketball. And we can think of a million examples in this style. So even within the standard S&C, the standard gym exercises, there is more or less specificity. There's a post I might put out today that I've been thinking about. It's like, specificity is non-binary. It's not it's specific or it's not. Like, you can be functional fluid, right? So there are shades of gray as to how something is more or less specific, which is the whole premise of the spectrum of specificity. So depending on the tweaks to an exercise, depending on how we set it up, like all these different variables we can manipulate to give an athlete more benefit from doing an exercise. So when people are thinking up these more sport specific exercises, The only thing we're really bothered about is it going to benefit their sport more or less than the standard version? And with those crazy, ridiculous ones, it probably is going to benefit less than something that looks a little bit more like the sport.
Mm.
If they've got something weird going on in their body, then there might be a really good reason to target a really specific part of the motion. Say somebody's spine doesn't move very well, then we might be working on thoracic spine mobility so that they can then say, yeah, throw a baseball, hit a golf ball better. So we might need to go further away from that sport specific movement, but it's only because it still serves the overall goal of being better at the sport.
Yeah, and I guess that's where even like when you start to think about what else you could think about when it in like the gym based activities, I really enjoyed like the push press rather than a delt raise.
Mm,
There was the one that you wrote down about the if you're a Gi BJJ competitor, how
yeah,
like doing a pull up with a towel
yeah,
compared to a pull up on a bar, because essentially how you have to grip and hold, and it's funny when you say an example or like the sandbag clean rather than a barbell clean for a wrestler,
yeah,
like those two movements, you can clearly see the carryover to the sport.
exactly.
And it's like that it, and they are two, say, functional exercises. And if you put them in a GPP program, they wouldn't look obscure. They wouldn't,
Exactly.
because it's a ready, but they're also sport specific.
Exactly.
So it's and it's just the fact that we do try to put our stake in one side just to
Exactly.
make a noise, and you're
Mm,
like it's a shame. It is a shame, because I do think it's the importance of like nuance and conversations like this, because when people start to break these things down, because I could just imagine, like, over time, if no one kind of spoke more about the middle, you'd have people start saying, "There's no need for this sports coach at this team because he's unnecessary. You can just do this. You can get away with this. They don't need the specificity." And you're like, what? Like, come on. These guys have been working in, like, not only do they understand the sport to a high level of degree, like that sport specifically, and all the stresses that their body gets put under, because it's like, yes, you have movements which are really optimal for the sport, but are they optimal for the sport at all times of the year? Are they only in season, out season, when the body's needing recovery, when it needs to be stressed? All these sort of nuance, like details
yeah.
are needed. And for having a sport specific coach, they have all those details because they've been there, they've been in the trenches. And it's when we're on Instagram and people that aren't sports coaches saying you don't need sports coaches to do the sports shit, you're like, you're not a fucking sports coach.
Yeah.
Like, oh
Exactly.
God, it's
No.
hard. It is hard to
Yeah.
hear and see, but it's, I think if you're educated enough, you understand why. So
Yeah.
you kind of just brush it off. But a
Yeah.
lot of people don't just brush it off, and they really dig deep into it and think, fuck, I'm wrong. This is what it is.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's the point, is that people don't always critically analyze the statement that's being presented to them. So that, oh, this
Mm,
person's saying it, it must be true. I can't be bothered to question whether it might be or it might not be. And like you said there, when you go through those exercises where certain variations of a certain movement you can see being more helpful to certain athletes, it's just so obvious. Like we clearly accept that some exercises are more or less specific to certain athletes, so, and because they more closely represent the demands of the sport.
yeah.
And that is sport specificity. It's not on or off. It's not yes or no. It is a sliding scale. And yeah, what you're saying there is bang on. Like, this is the reason why we have sport specific S&C coaches. You have people who specialize in rugby strength coach. You have
Mm,
people that specialize in S&C for running. You have people who specialize in golf performance. And the reason is because the demands of each sport are distinct. The way you're going to train somebody is different. And it's different in many different ways. It's different not just from a movement selection point of view, from a psychological point of view, from a like endurance point of view, the
mm,
mobility point of view. There's so many different nuances of how you would train a different athlete. This is why you get specialists. Don't get me wrong, I'm the biggest advocate of a principle-based understanding. Like, we should understand the principles of human movement and human training and adaptation, but when you're actually applying it to one person in front of you, things do change and there
yeah.
are decisions to be made which are better or worse for certain people. And, you know, somebody who works with a Formula One driver as their strength and conditioning coach is going to have insight into what their body needs to do more than somebody who's never gone close to that. So they're more likely to be able to do a better job than, you know, PT off the internet.
Yeah, this reminds me of I was listening to Joe Rogan the other day, and I can't think who it was with, and they were talking about a boxer. Again, I can't remember the name, but like this boxer, his dad was his coach, and he took him out of boxing to start dancing, so he understood footwork, so that when he then come back 2 years later, and he was he was unbeatable because people couldn't understand what his feet were doing and where he was placed in the ring.
Yeah.
So then, he's like, again, because he was matched up with some of these heavyweights and stuff that are just, or it might have been in UFC or whatever it was. It was in a fighting sport, but the footwork. So it was actually his sport specificness was actually going to be a bit of a hindrance to him because it's what everyone else was doing. So he had to look outside of his sport, but the principles of footwork were still there. So the specificity was still there to some
Exactly.
degree. It was just not sport specific. It was kind of movement specific.
Well, I'd argue that it is still sport specific. So his abstraction from boxing was being nimble, being light on the feet, having fast footwork. So his dad made the decision to be slightly less specific from boxing so that he could overload the skill of footwork.
Yeah.
And he saw dancing as the way to overload the skill of footwork because in traditional boxing training, he wouldn't get such a strong footwork stimulus. He then brought it back into boxing. So even in those examples, it's less sport specific because the training stimulus demands it be less. In a standard boxing training environment, he wouldn't be able to overload his footwork in the same way. So it's still sliding scale of sport specificity, right?
Yeah. So I guess like you've put a heading in here, so don't take it, but like how GPP is an opinion,
Yeah.
and that we all use our own bodies in our own ways. And I like that because it is true, kind of like what I alluded to at the very start of this episode. And it's like, what is being physically prepared for life for you? Like, what do you do in your life? If you are an athlete, you're going to have some specifics you need to deal with, and you're going to have some weaknesses and some strengths you're going to need to work on. Whereas if you are just Dave from down the gym who just wants to look good, you've got a lot more room for being able to do a lot more scope and just have fun with training because there's a lot less specificity in there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you said it there. GPP, general physical preparedness, varies depending on who you're talking to. And there's plenty of functional fitness programs out there, loads of great ones, loads of not so great ones. And they all have different movements, different emphasis or emphases, if that's the plural. Classic example would be CrossFit versus F45. They're both functional fitness programs. Intending to make people generally physically prepared for life, but they have very different movements in. And if we knew definitively what the general physical needs of a human body was, there'd be a lot more similarity in how these GPP programs look. But as you said there, the reality is different humans have different use cases for their body. So person A and person B, to be generally prepared for their personal lives, might need to be trained very differently. And this is the rub of generic programs. And I think there's a lot of great ones out there that do a lot of good stuff for people. But the reality is, one of the fundamental principles of training is the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. So your body adapts specifically. It doesn't adapt generally.
No.
What you ask it to do, it will get better at. So whoever has written your GPP program thinks is important, you will get prepared for that. And there's plenty of great ones that are very well rounded for things that many people will do, but none of them prepare people for everything somebody might want to do. And this is why I think we talked about it in an old episode. There's a great article online about this NFL player that he's a young, impressionable guy, and he basically got sucked into doing CrossFit at his local box, and the head coach took him under his wing, and he got really good at CrossFit, but all of his metrics in football reduced. He like lost a lot of weight. He carried less yards, all these sorts of things because he got good at CrossFit. He got less good at NFL.
Yeah.
And the point is, you get good at what you do and what you practice. So when somebody's laid out their opinion of what a GPP program should look like, you've got to ask, do I agree with that for what I want to use my body for? And I think the best generic programs are actually quite specific in that they're for a specific type of person. Like all programs, right? You're trying to take somebody from A to B. So if you've got a bunch of people who have different starting points, it's going to hit well for some people and hit it poorly for others. So if you say, I work with people who've trained for this many years in this way and struggle with these things, you're going to provide a much better generic program than I make everybody good at everything from wherever they're starting, right? It's kind of obvious, but that's just the reality of how the body adapts. So yeah, I think that's my main takeaway is just check your A and your B, where you're starting from and where you're trying to go to, matches up with the author of your GPP program.
Yeah, and also I know it's really common to say, like with GPP, we're getting prepared for life. Like, in case you fall over, like you've got to be able to get back up and being able to sit down in a seat. But you're talking about old people here, so then again, there you have to know your age demographic, because it's like, yes, you need to, but I don't think you need to be planning how to get up from the floor or how to sit down when you're in your like mid-20s, early 30s. You just, hopefully, you shouldn't need to have that type of practice. That should be a GPP skill you do not need to practice. But we do burpees, we do squats, but we overload them like fuck. So we enable ourselves to get stronger in some of these movement patterns. So then as we do get older, the regression is a lot less. So we're not just doing a body weight squat, even if that is enough of a stimulus for when we do get older. So I think, as you say, defining who you are and understanding what it is you need. And that basically comes up in so many of our episodes. Because it's so essential, because a lot of us don't know. Some of us are like, we're in our own little no man's land where it's really hard to specify exactly what we want to achieve. Because in life, you're going to change. You're going to want to do one thing for a period of time, another thing for another period of time. We don't have to be married to one thing, unless you're an athlete of a sport who needs to get better at that sport. Then you need to do what it takes to get better at that sport. And that will mean sport specificity in your training.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably some of the nice nuances that most good coaches can help you get better at whatever you want, but only really great coaches can help you figure out what you want. I think that's the way to think about it.
Yeah.
And the more clear you are on where you want to get to, the easier it is to get there. And we've definitely spoken about this in the past, where the starting point to so many consultations is, I just want to get generally fitter, be healthier. And that means so many different things to different people that, somebody might want to look better. Somebody might want to run a marathon. Somebody might want to PB their bench press. Like, those are all different ways of being fitter. But yeah, you've got to really read between the lines to understand what that person wants. And I think almost everybody would benefit from spending a little bit of time asking themselves that question.
Yeah. And I guess you have to ask yourself the question of, why are you training at the moment? Like, what is it that you're not doing in the sport that you need to be training for?
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of goes back to the point we were talking about earlier, where why aren't you just practicing the sport? Why aren't you just doing games? Why aren't you just doing training matches? You're generally trying to abstract part of the sport so that you can develop it to then reintegrate it into the sport. So are you trying to work on your cardio so that you have more work capacity to do more of the sport? Are you trying to improve your explosive power if you're a rugby player, an NFL player, so you can break more tackles? You're trying to take one element of the sport and make it as good as possible in a way that you couldn't just by playing the game. So in those examples, right, if you want to get good at breaking tackles, depending how the game goes, you might have single digit opportunities to practice that. So you can accelerate your rate of improving that aspect of the game by doing specific work on that element of the game. And this is almost every coaching decision comes down to this. We are trying to figure out what our athlete needs that's going to give them the most benefit in actually playing the sport. So we're not just trying to do general, like it's different if you're in a team context and you have to make blanket decisions for all players. But if you're working one-on-one with somebody, you should have a good idea of what the best return on time and effort invested is for their training. At the end of the day, they have to do all their sports practice because that is most important. If you've got 2, 3, 4 S&C sessions a week, what's going to be most bang for buck, return on time invested, best for their on-pitch performance? And this is why you might choose something very sport specific rather than just, back squats, because all good athletes back squat.
So why might we be less specific?
Yeah. So this comes back to the injury risk point. Like if you are, say, go back to rugby, if you're a rugby S&C coach and you guys are doing loads of running already, they obviously play on their feet, they do all their rugby practice on their feet, and somebody might have a knee niggle, but they're not fit enough for where you want them to be. So you need them to improve their cardio. And biking doesn't hurt their knee. You can get that intended training stimulus of improving their cardiovascular output without stressing the knee. In a perfect world, they would be doing it on feet, but for that specific situation, they can still retain the training stimulus to their heart and lungs without the extra stress on the joints. But yeah, like I say, in a perfect world, if they did it on their feet, they would be leveling up the tissue tolerance in the lower limbs as well at the same time as working their cardio. So we'd only go less specific if we kind of lose the training stimulus by staying more specific, or there's an increased injury risk.
So I guess we get more carryover and mitigate injury risk if we keep things a lot more specific. And then, because what I'm trying to think about here is if we're, say, a runner and we're doing loads of miles and our coach is noticing our body's breaking down at the moment, but we still need to kind of keep up the stress on the body, we might go that a little bit less specific and get us on a bike to as kind of like you mentioned there, to keep the aerobic stress there, but not quite then the tissue stress. Whereas if we want to make sure we're keeping that specificity high, we want to keep trundling away on the roads, and we might then obviously have to adjust the volume and intensity there to kind of keep the specificity high. So that's when we want to be keeping it more specific.
Exactly. So this is the risk reward decision that we have to make as coaches. Is we know we want to improve this runner's cardiovascular output, their endurance, their stamina, and ideally we want to do it in running, but there's only so many miles per week that this runner can tolerate. However, they recovery wise could do more cardio if it was on the bike. So until they develop the tissue tolerance to run more miles per week, we can still be leveling up their cardio. So we're slightly less specific, because if we did more miles on feet, they would get niggles and injuries, which ultimately takes them away from their training goal. So we go a little bit less specific, but still retain the training stimulus. But another runner who's more used to running, they would benefit more if they could get the cardio stimulus and the time on feet at the same time, because they're getting a 2-for-1 there. But that's the ideal, but we can take a step away if one of those aspects is compromised.
I guess the main problem comes from when we try to make it a one size fits all. And this is I think with the whole GPP side of things, is in it's one size fits all and that's the answer. And when I say GPP, that includes things like CrossFit and everything, because it's like that was the thought at the start when CrossFit kind of first come around, and that was their whole thing. You do not need anything else. We cover all the key physical movement patterns, and that's enough. That's all you need for life. And then we kind of got sucked into this functional fitness space, saying like this is the answer. And then functional fitness essentially turned into like GPP without like some of the high-end gymnastic-y stuff. So it blurs the lines, and I
Yeah.
think this is where it gets muddy because again, back to social media, when people are then seeing people training and stuff like that, and people are saying this is the way to train and so forth, this is the way to train for that individual.
Yeah, exactly that. So I want to make it clear that I'm still a big fan of GPP programs, functional fitness, people moving their bodies in varied ways. But the important caveat is that if you know what you're training for, it's better to train directly for it rather than just lump in for a GPP program. And it's a multifactorial decision in that maybe you just have more fun doing CrossFit classes with your mates and you're willing to train in a more indirect way with less carryover. But if you are taking your sport seriously, there is no question that training more specifically will have more physiological benefits. But like I said, it's multifactorial. So it's not the only thing to consider for a non-elite or super serious athlete. But I think it's misleading online because it's presented like as if that's not true when it very clearly is true that
Yeah.
sport specificity produces better results.
We just need to be clear on the training stimulus, right?
That's it, mate. It's all about the training stimulus.
So I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. Really did enjoy today. I think it's as a coach, I see these things and I can take a lot of them as just what they are. But when I have clients forward me the post or something like that, that even these are educated individuals that are questioning things. Like, hang on a minute. So then just imagine someone that isn't necessarily that bit more educated in the fitness sphere, maybe just getting into it, and it can get very confusing. And I think the more conversations we have like this, I think it can really help clear up some of those questions. And we might be a little bit more in the middle here, but just I think we have a little bit more clarity on what's needed. So if you do play a sport, get clear on what the demands of your sport are, whether that is sport in the gym or that sport out on the field or with other people, whatever this sport is, you just need to know where to improve.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to be generally fit and healthy for life, then think about doing some more stuff outside of the gym. Do stuff that where your body's moving in all these different positions that aren't just generally up and down, if you're lucky, left and right, and rotate.
Yeah.
And then I guess you can start with an exercise, or you can start with a real movement and then progress it, whether that's then like we mentioned about throwing the ball. So real movement of throwing a ball, you can progress it by adding load or taking away load and then getting faster. So the clearer we can be on these tasks, the better our body can be prepared for them.
Yeah.
So it was a really awesome episode. Loved it. And thank you very much, as always, for listening. We really do appreciate you each week. If there is a topic you want us to cover, we would love to dive a bit deeper into some of these topics that you might be really wanting to know more about. So thank you, as always, for your time. We really appreciate you. And we'll be seeing you next week.
Thanks, guys.